Before the world learned to fear Pablo Escobar, before his name became synonymous with cocaine, violence, and power, there was a woman operating in the shadows who made even the most ruthless men uneasy. Her reputation did not rely on charm or publicity. It was built on fear, precision, and absolute control. Her name was Griselda Blanco, and the empire she built would become the blueprint for everything that followed. While others chased fame, she mastered terror. While men fought for dominance, she quietly took it. And by the time the world noticed her, it was already too late. Griselda Blanco did not rise from privilege or protection. She was shaped by violence from childhood, hardened by poverty, and molded by survival. Growing up in Colombia, she learned early that mercy was weakness and hesitation was fatal. Crime was not a choice for her. It was a language she learned fluently. By the time she entered the drug trade, she was not experimenting. She was executing a vision. She understood logistics, loyalty, and fear better than anyone around her. And most importantly, she understood people. She knew how to control them, how to break them, and how to make them obey. When cocaine began flooding into the United States, many saw opportunity. Griselda saw domination. She pioneered trafficking routes, invented concealment methods that would later become standard, and built a distribution network that moved massive quantities of cocaine with terrifying efficiency. Long before Miami became a war zone, she had already turned it into her chessboard. Every move was calculated, every risk was weighed, and every betrayal was punished without hesitation. What truly separated her from the men around her was not just brutality, it was imagination. She didn't merely order killings, she engineered fear. She popularized the use of motorcycle assassins, turning drive-by shootings into a signature of terror that paralyzed entire neighborhoods. Violence under her command was not emotional, it was strategic. Bodies were messages, deaths were warnings, and the message was always the same: cross her and nothing will save you. Law enforcement struggled to understand her because she didn't fit their expectations. She was a woman in a world ruled by men, but she was never underestimated by those who knew her. Rivals feared her more than they feared entire cartels. Associates followed her not out of loyalty but out of survival. Even those closest to her lived under constant threat, knowing that love and death were separated by a single mistake. Her personal life was as ruthless as her business. Marriages ended in bloodshed. Lovers became enemies. Even family ties offered no protection. To Griselda, sentiment was a liability. Anyone who threatened her control, emotionally or financially, was eliminated. She ruled through paranoia, and she survived because of it. As her empire grew, so did her legend. Miami burned during the cocaine wars, and while many blamed chaos, insiders knew there was structure behind the madness. Her network generated hundreds of millions of dollars. Her reach extended across borders, and her influence shaped the future of the drug trade. Pablo Escobar did not invent the modern cocaine empire. He inherited the world she helped build. But absolute power demands absolute isolation. Griselda trusted no one. Every ally was temporary, every friendship conditional. Over time, her paranoia consumed her. The same fear she used to control others began to control her. Law enforcement closed in, informants turned, and the walls began to shrink. When she was finally captured, it was not the end of her story, but it was the end of her empire. Prison did not soften her. Time did not bring reflection. Even behind bars, her reputation followed her like a shadow. When she was eventually released, she returned to a world that had moved on without her. New kings ruled the streets. New cartels controlled the trade. And the woman who once terrified nations became a relic of a more brutal era. Her death came quietly, ironically mirroring the violence she once unleashed. A motorcycle assassin. A single moment. A full circle. No empire. No protection. Just the echo of a life built on fear. Griselda Blanco did not seek admiration. She did not want to be loved. She wanted to be obeyed, and for years she was. Her story is not one of glamour or rebellion. It is a warning. A reminder that power taken through terror eventually collapses under its own weight. Pablo Escobar became famous. Griselda Blanco became infamous. And in the dark history of organized crime, she remains the woman who proved that brutality has no gender and fear has no mercy. As the years passed and her name slowly faded from headlines, the true scale of Griselda Blanco's influence became clearer. Long after her empire collapsed, the systems she created continued to function without her. Trafficking routes she pioneered were still in use. Smuggling techniques she invented were taught to new generations of criminals. The structure of modern drug organizations, the compartmentalization, the use of fear as discipline, the cold separation of emotion from business, carried her fingerprints. She was no longer present, but she was everywhere. Even the men who would later become legends of the cocaine trade were, knowingly or not, walking through doors she had already forced open. What made her story even more unsettling was how deliberately she erased herself while building something enormous. She avoided cameras, avoided unnecessary attention, avoided the spotlight that others craved. Power, to her, was not about being seen, it was about being unavoidable. When people whispered her name, they did not speak of wealth or luxury, they spoke of consequences. Entire neighborhoods changed their behavior based on rumors of her mood. Rivals altered routes simply because they suspected her involvement. Fear moved faster than drugs ever could. Behind that fear was a mind constantly at war with itself. Paranoia was not a side effect of her success, it was the engine that drove it. She trusted no one fully, slept lightly, and lived as though betrayal was always seconds away. This constant vigilance kept her alive far longer than most, but it also stripped away any chance at peace. There was no victory she could enjoy, no fortune she could relax into. Every achievement only raised the stakes. Every expansion created new enemies. Every show of strength demanded an even stronger response. The irony of Griselda Blanco's life is that the very traits that allowed her to dominate a violent world also guaranteed her loneliness within it. She could command armies, but she could not build loyalty. She could control fear, but she could not control time. As law enforcement pressure increased and the criminal world evolved, her relevance began to slip. Younger players were more cautious, more discreet, less driven by ego and bloodshed. The era of raw terror was giving way to quieter operations. The world no longer needed someone like her, and it showed. When she was finally gone, there was no empire left to defend her lega. Sigh. No organization claimed her name. No successors honored her openly. Her story survived not because it was celebrated, but because it was too extreme to forget. She became a ghost story told among criminals, a warning whispered in corridors of power about what happens when control turns into obsession and fear replaces strategy. And yet, history could not ignore her. Analysts, investigators, and historians began to acknowledge what the streets had always known. She was not an anomaly. She was a pioneer, a figure so influential that even her enemies borrowed from her methods. Pablo Escobar would eventually eclipse her in fame, but not in foundation. His empire rose in a world she helped design, one where violence was currency and fear was law. Griselda Blanco did not just participate in the drug war. She reshaped it. She proved that the most dangerous figures are not always the loudest or the most visible. Sometimes they are the ones who operate quietly, relentlessly, and without remorse. Her life stands as a dark testament to what happens when survival becomes ambition, and ambition becomes absolute power. And long after her death, the shadow she cast still lingers, reminding the world that before the kings of cocaine, there was a queen who ruled without mercy. As time moved on, the story of Griselda Blanco began to take on a strange dual life. In one version, she was mythologized, turned into a larger-than-life figure, almost unreal in her cruelty and command. In the third, more unsettling version, she was studied carefully, coldly, by those trying to understand how one individual could bend an entire criminal ecosystem around her will. The truth sat somewhere in between. She was not a monster born from legend, nor was she simply a product of her environment. She was a calculated force, shaped by brutality and sharpened by intelligence, who recognized early that fear, once unleashed, could be managed like a resource. What made her especially dangerous was that she never confused violence with chaos. Every act of brutality served a purpose. Every killing was a calculation. Where others lost control to ego or rage, she used restraint when it mattered and excess when it sent the strongest message. That discipline allowed her to outlast rivals who were louder, flashier, and far more reckless. While others celebrated success, she prepared for retaliation. While others trusted allies, she planned for betrayal. Survival was not something she hoped for. It was something she engineered. Yet beneath that cold precision was a constant sense of war, not just with enemies, but with time itself. The criminal world does not reward longevity. It consumes it. Griselda understood this better than anyone, and still she pushed forward, expanding her reach even when retreat might have saved her. Power, once tasted, became impossible to surrender. Each new conquest raised the question she could never escape: how much control is enough? For her, the answer was always the same: more. As the years passed, her name became less a person and more a symbol. For some, it represented ruthless efficiency. For others, it was a warning about excess and obsession. For law enforcement, it became proof that leadership in criminal organizations did not follow traditional rules. Gender, background, and public image mattered far less than decisiveness and fear. She shattered assumptions simply by existing and surviving where others predicted failure. In the end, what makes Griselda Blanco's story so haunting is not just what she did, but what she revealed about power itself. She showed that authority does not always come from charisma or respect. Sometimes it comes from unpredictability, sometimes it comes from the willingness to go further than anyone else dares. And sometimes it comes at a cost so high that the victory becomes indistinguishable from defeat. Long after her death, her influence remains woven into the fabric of organized crime history. Not as a role model, not as a hero, but as a reminder. A reminder that absolute control demands absolute sacrifice, and that empires built on fear rarely leave room for peace. Griselda Blanco ruled a world where mercy was weakness, loyalty was temporary, and survival was never guaranteed. And in doing so, she carved her place into history, not as someone who wanted to be remembered, but as someone the world could not forget. As her story continues to echo through time, one uncomfortable truth becomes impossible to ignore. Griselda Blanco did not simply exploit a violent system. She mastered it better than anyone around her. She understood that crime was not just about drugs or money, but about psychology, about knowing exactly how far people could be pushed before they broke, about knowing when fear was more effective than loyalty, and when silence was more powerful than noise. While others ruled through visibility, she ruled through uncertainty. No one ever knew what she was thinking, and that uncertainty kept entire networks frozen in place. Even her enemies admitted something chilling: she was always 3 steps ahead. When rivals plotted, she had already accounted for it. When law enforcement closed one door, she had already opened another. Her mind worked like a machine trained for survival, constantly scanning for weakness, constantly preparing for betrayal. And yet, that same mind trapped her in a state of permanent tension. There was no future where she could retire, no version of her life where she could disappear peacefully. She had built an empire that required her to remain dangerous at all times, because the moment she stopped being feared was the moment everything collapsed. As new generations entered the drug trade, many tried to imitate her reputation without understanding its cost. They copied the violence, but not the discipline. They embraced the fear, but not the control, and most of them fell quickly. What they failed to see was that Griselda's power was never just in her brutality. It was in her patience. She waited when others rushed. She watched when others reacted. She struck only when the impact would be irreversible. That restraint is what made her unstoppable for so long, and it is also what makes her story so difficult to replicate. Her legacy remains deeply uncomfortable because it forces a question society rarely wants to confront. If someone like Griselda Blanco could rise, dominate, and survive for decades, what does that say about the systems meant to stop her? Her existence exposed cracks in law enforcement, corruption in institutions, and the terrifying efficiency of organized crime when intelligence meets ruthlessness. She did not bend the rules. She exploited the fact that the rules were never designed to stop someone like her. And perhaps the most haunting part of her story is this: she never lost because she was weak. She lost because time always wins. No matter how careful, how feared, or how intelligent, the world eventually shifts. Allies age, enemies adapt, systems evolve. The kind of raw terror that once kept cities silent slowly becomes outdated. When that happens, even the most powerful figures become vulnerable, not because they changed, but because the world around them did. Griselda Blanco lived and died as a product of absolute control and absolute isolation. She trusted no one, loved no one without suspicion, and ruled without mercy. Her life was a constant negotiation with death, one she managed longer than most ever could. And in the end, her story does not glorify power. It exposes its price. Because while she may have made men like Pablo Escobar look small in their early days, her fate proved something far more chilling: that dominance built on fear leaves nothing behind but echoes. And echoes are all that remain when the empire is gone. As historians and crime analysts look back, what stands out most is not just the scale of Griselda Blanco's violence, but how completely she rewrote the rules of dominance in an unforgiving world. She proved that leadership did not require consensus, charisma, or even loyalty. It required certainty. People followed her because hesitation around her was dangerous. Silence became safer than speech. Obedience became instinctive. In many ways, she turned fear into infrastructure, something that functioned even when she wasn't present. That is why her influence survived arrests, betrayals, and time itself. Yet beneath the legend, there is an unsettling emptiness. Griselda won battles, controlled territory, and terrified enemies, but she never achieved the one thing power usually promises: security. Every night was lived as if it might be the last. Every alliance was temporary. Every success demanded another act of brutality to protect it. The empire required constant feeding, and it fed on her humanity first. There was no celebration without suspicion, no quiet moment without calculation. Power did not free her, it imprisoned her long before any cell ever did. Her story also exposes a darker reflection of society's fascination with crime. The world often remembers figures like her for their audacity, their dominance, their defiance of authority. But buried beneath that fascination is the truth that her rise depended on suffering, on fear that seeped into neighborhoods, on families destroyed, on lives reduced to messages. The myth survives because it is dramatic. The reality lingers because it was devastating. In the end, Griselda Blanco did not lose to a rival cartel or a single law enforcement operation. She lost to inevitability, to aging, to a world that no longer needed her kind of terror. The skills that once made her untouchable slowly became obsolete. And when the fear faded, what remained was a woman who had sacrificed everything for control, only to discover that control never truly belonged to her. Her legacy is not a crown passed down or an empire reclaimed. It is a caution carved into history, a reminder that power taken through violence demands endless payment, and that the most feared figures often live the most confined lives. Griselda Blanco may have stood taller than legends who came after her, may have made giants look small in their early days, but her story ends the same way all empires built on fear do: alone, echoing, and finally silent. And yet, even after silence claimed her, the question her life leaves behind refuses to fade. Was Griselda Blanco a product of her time, or was her time shaped by her? The lines blur the longer her story is examined. She did not simply exploit chaos, she organized it. She did not stumble into power, she carved it out with intention, patience, and an iron will that refused compromise. In a world dominated by men who believed violence alone made them kings, she proved that strategy, fear, and psychological control were far more lethal. That realization unsettled everyone who came after her, because it meant that the most dangerous enemy was not the loudest one, but the quiet mind planning in the dark. Her life forces an uncomfortable reckoning with how society measures strength. From the outside, she looked unstoppable, commanding wealth and obedience on a scale few ever reach. But inside that dominance was a permanent state of siege. There was no moment when she could stop being who she had become. No version of herself existed beyond the empire. Power erased alternatives. It narrowed her world until it was nothing more than threats, defenses, and survival. The crown she wore had no weight of gold, only the constant pressure of fear pushing down from every direction. What makes her legacy endure is not admiration, but disturbance. She challenges easy narratives. She cannot be neatly categorized as villain or anomaly. She was a strategist, a tyrant, a survivor, and ultimately a warning. Her rise showed what is possible when intelligence and brutality align. Her fall showed what happens when a life is buoy. LT with no exit plan. The world remembers her not because she wanted to be remembered, but because forgetting her would mean ignoring how fragile order really is. In the end, Griselda Blanco did not make Pablo Escobar look small because she was louder or richer. She made him look small because she understood something earlier and more completely than most, that real power does not ask for permission, does not seek applause, and does not need to be loved. But her story also proves the final haunting truth. Power that survives on fear alone eventually consumes everything around it, including the one who commands it. And when that happens, all that remains is a name, a shadow, and a lesson history will repeat for those who fail to listen. As the final layers of her story settle into history, one last truth emerges, quieter than the gunshots and far heavier than the legend. Griselda Blanco did not chase immortality, yet she achieved it in the most unforgiving way possible. Her name became permanent not because of admiration, but because of consequence. Every time the cocaine trade is analyzed, every time the roots of cartel power are traced backward, her presence appears like a dark watermark beneath the surface. She is there not as a footnote, but as a foundation. What makes this so unsettling is how little room her life leaves for illusion. There is no redemption arc waiting in the shadows, no misunderstood genius softened by time. Her success demanded total commitment, and he paid with everything that could have made her human. Trust, tenderness, peace, and safety were all traded away for dominance. The world often romanticizes crime as rebellion or ambition, but her life strips that fantasy bare. It shows what happens when survival turns into obsession, and obsession hardens into identity. In her final years, removed from the center of power she once controlled, the silence must have been deafening. No crowds, no fear-driven obedience, no constant motion of an empire expanding, just time, memories, and the knowledge that the machine she built no longer needed her. That may have been the cruelest punishment of all, not prison, not death, but irrelevance. To outlive your power is to watch it erase you, and still the echo remains, not because she was the most violent, or the richest, or the most famous, but because she was the most uncompromising. She showed the world what unchecked control looks like when it is sharpened by intelligence and stripped of mercy. She showed how fear can build empires faster than loyalty ever could. And she showed how those same empires inevitably collapse inward, leaving nothing behind but stories told in lowered voices. Griselda Blanco's life does not end with a moral victory or poetic justice. It ends with a warning written in shadows, a reminder that power without limits creates monsters, and monsters eventually run out of places to hide. She may have made Pablo Escobar look small in the beginning, but in the end, her story stands alone, not as inspiration, not as legend, but as a chilling testament to how far a human being can go when nothing is sacred and nothing is enough. In the very end, Griselda Blanco's story closes not with triumph, but with an eerie stillness that feels heavier than any prison cell or violent finale. When the noise faded and the fear she once commanded dissolved into memory, what remained was the stark outline of a life spent outrunning its own shadow. She had built an empire so ruthless that it rewired the rules of organized crime, yet that same empire left no room for legacy, no heir to inherit meaning, no future beyond survival. Power had given her everything except an exit. What history ultimately reveals is that her greatest weapon was never violence alone, but certainty. She never doubted herself, never hesitated when others paused, never allowed morality to slow momentum. That certainty carried her higher than anyone expected, especially in a world that underestimated her from the beginning. But certainty is also a trap. It leaves no space for change, no room for reflection, no path back once the line is crossed. By the time she might have wanted something different, there was nothing different left to choose. Her life exposes the brutal truth behind criminal empires that often get romanticized from a distance. There is no balance, no secret happiness waiting behind the money and fear. There is only escalation. Every victory demands a harsher defense. Every threat requires a louder response. Eventually, the machine consumes the person who built it. Griselda Blanco did not lose because she lacked intelligence or strength. She lost because an existence built entirely on control cannot survive the moment control slips, even slightly, and that is why her story endures longer than those who followed her. Pablo Escobar became a symbol, a headline, a myth polished by repetition. Griselda Blanco became something colder and more unsettling, a case study in absolute power. She reminds the world that the most dangerous figures are not always the ones chasing attention, but the ones who understand fear better than love, strategy better than impulse, and silence better than celebration. In the final reckoning, she stands alone in history, not as a hero, not as a cautionary tale softened by time, but as a mirror held up to the darkest extremes of ambition. Her rise shows how far a human can go when survival becomes purpose. Her fall shows what happens when purpose leaves no room for humanity. And her legacy lingers as a warning written between the lines of history that power taken without limits does not elevate, it isolates, consumes, and ultimately erases everything except the echo of what once was.